What's going on, guys? I'm John and this is Player Recap, a channel where I sum up some of the story and lore of the games I enjoy playing. Throughout Wuthering Waves, we play as and encounter different Resonators. It's pretty obvious that these are people who can do things nobody else can, but what's not always obvious is why. Well, the short and sweet answer is that they have a power called a Forte, which lets them resonate with and manipulate the world around them in specific ways. To explain that in more detail, I'm going to need to lay some groundwork. As a quick warning, this video will have spoilers up to 1.3, so if you want to go in blind, it might be best to come back after you're all caught up. Let's get into it. As Yang Yang states at the very start of the game, everything is made up of frequencies. This piece of information is really easy to overlook, but it's huge. The world of Solaris 3 has been reeling ever since the disastrous event called the First Lament obliterated the laws of physics. If an old legend Chixia mentioned is to be believed, then an extremely powerful figure, potentially Rover at their prime, repaired the laws using the first echo, which is why the world is currently functional. Although I use functional in the loosest sense of the word, because the wave-worn phenomena, that is the bizarre and often deadly shenanigans caused by the first and subsequent laments, are still steadily eroding what remains of Solaris 3. But whatever the case, the end result is that frequencies are now the fundamental building block of reality. The story hasn't gone into too much detail about what they are yet, but they're repeatedly implied to be acoustic vibrations that determine what something is. Anything you can think of, from physical things like people and buildings, to intangible things like thoughts and emotions, is a manifestation of a set of underlying frequencies. To get a bit philosophical, you can think of them as the sound of something's very existence. Conventionally speaking, a frequency is the rate at which something oscillates, but it's anyone's guess what medium these vibrations occur within. You're probably going to get a headache trying to figure it out, at least until we get more information. The reason I brought all of this up, though, is that if you can influence the frequencies that make something up, you can manipulate its very nature and dictate the way it behaves, and that is how a lot of the cool stuff we see in Solaris 3 works, from the marvels of the Corte Savante to the powers wielded by Resonators and Tacet Discords alike. These phenomena might look like magic, and there was even a time where people believed they were, but they're all rooted firmly in science. In fact, scientists have formally established several fields such as weatherology, echoacoustics, and resonology to study them. Moving on, one of the ways to manipulate frequencies is called resonance. This is another fuzzy area that the story hasn't completely explored, but we at least know that when two things have similar enough frequencies, that similarity can act as a bridge that allows them to affect each other in spectacular ways. This effect is sometimes deliberate and controlled, and other times weird things happen by pure chance. And that finally leads us to Resonators. It's possible for an ordinary person to resonate with something they encounter in a way that triggers a metamorphosis called awakening. Awakening not only enhances your physical capabilities, but creates a symbol somewhere in your body called a Tacet Mark and grants you a set of resonance abilities collectively known as your Forte. The term awakening appears to refer to the awakening of this mysterious power. The way you reach your awakening varies. It can be a gradual transition, as was the case for Yang Yang, who is said to have been sensitive to her surroundings from a young age and isn't even sure when she crossed the line into being a resonator. Or it can be catalyzed in an instant by something like an emotional outburst. This is true for Dunjin, who is strongly implied to have awakened as a result of the rage she felt when her family was murdered in cold blood, and Baiji, who felt a desperate desire to resurrect her teammates after her expedition was slaughtered by Tacet Discords in a collapsing sonorosphere. However, in a surprising number of cases, a Resonator's awakening isn't brought on by any identifiable event. The exact cause remains unknown, which suggests that there may be an element that nobody's singled out yet. It's also possible for a Resonator to be created, which could potentially circumvent the need for awakening. For example, the Shorekeeper was made by an ancient civilization to assist pre-amnesia Rover. Rover encountered her in the form of a crystal, and the meeting of their frequencies triggered her completion. The crystal shattered, and the Shorekeeper coalesced from remnant energy. The text states that Rover awakened her, but it's hard to say whether it solely refers to her gaining consciousness, or if the incident also counts as the Resonator's awakening, and Rover's frequencies somehow influenced her Forte. Anyway, although it's probably obvious by now, you don't need to be human to be a Resonator. As mentioned, Shorekeeper is a remnant energy construct. There's also everyone's favorite Resonator, Ling Yang, who is actually a member of a beast-like species called the Xuan Ni. So, being a Resonator is more about having a Forte than how you get there. let's take a look at the changes that usually come with becoming a Resonator. We've established that awakening gives you powers, but what powers? Well, the exact forte you get is generally determined by two criteria. 1. Your personality, which includes whatever is going on deep down in your subconscious, and 2. The frequencies you actually resonated with. This can be anything from fire to blood to the very concept of a legendary creature that you've never even met. As an example, Chang Li's only encounter with the mythological spirit bird she derives her flames from was, as far as we can tell, the stories she read as a child. It's not always obvious what frequencies cause the Resonator's awakening, but academics have developed a method of fingerprinting known as the resonance spectrum pattern. By comparing a Resonator's pattern to other known patterns, it's possible to suss out what exactly they're likely to have resonated with and what the range of their abilities might be. A strong similarity will result in a strong syntony reaction, syntony just being jargon for how readily something will resonate with something else. Yang Yang is an interesting example. Her pattern shows a 20% similarity to small bird species and airflows, which appears to be enough to evoke a strong syntony reaction. This explains why her forte lets her control and synchronize with the wind. She also has a 5% similarity to a few other samples, implying that she either resonated with a whole bunch of things, or her awakening process was contaminated by other frequencies, altering the direction of her development. The problem with this method of pattern matching is, of course, that it's useless if there are no patterns available for comparison. Someone like Jiyan is a complete mystery. His resonance spectrum pattern doesn't resemble any known samples. But anyway, as a result of how the awakening process works, there's a huge range in the form a Resonator's abilities can take. They can even be as minor as letting you predict rainfall by sensing the sound of water gathering in the sky, to the terrifying ability to wield time itself. This is further influenced by a Resonator's own control and inventiveness. Chang Li suffered considerably from her flames growing up, to the extent that her own master believed she would die young. But, over time, this is no longer an issue and her control has reached a frightening level. If you've ever wondered how her robes can keep burning away and coming back, the answer is simple. They're made of her flames. Her control over fire is so precise that she's not only able to give the burn on her arm a beautiful glowing effect, but she's literally able to modulate her flames into robes that she can wear over the rest of her clothes. Pretty neat. In addition to personalized resonance abilities, a Resonator's forte also grants them a more general ability to manipulate certain forms of energy. It's only been mentioned in passing, so we don't know the specifics, but this may refer to the attributes we see in the game. Each Resonator seems to be able to exert at least some control over an energy type aligned with their forte: fusion, glacial, aero, and so on. Verena is explicitly stated to be able to store and use spectral energy. Whether this covers the elements or not, a Resonator's energy manipulation is a huge advantage over non-Resonators because it means Resonators can interact with technology in ways that non-Resonators can't. Take Tacetite Weapons. These are generally armaments that draw on the Tacetite energy inside their cores to attack and deal serious damage to Tacet discords. I won't go into the specifics of what Tacetite energy is here, but this is a pretty big deal. It's been repeatedly hinted that conventional weaponry is not very effective against TDs, which means that if you ever find yourself in a fight with one, you're going to have a hard time coming out on top without resonance abilities or a Tacetite weapon of your own. The issue is that even if you do get your hands on a Tacetite weapon, being exposed to what's inside them has health risks for ordinary people. The Tacetite itself has a frequency that can cause ataxia, a disorder that results in a loss of muscle coordination, and the Tacetite energy inside can be volatile. This means that any Tacetite content of weapons made for non-Resonators has to be toned down. Resonators don't have to worry about this because they can just use their fortes to control the energy inside and convert it into a new form they can wield, making it safer for them and deadlier for their enemies. This advantage is one of several reasons why General Jiyan of the Midnight Rangers restructured the army so that the bulk of their primary combat units are now made up of Resonators, and most non-Resonators take up safer support roles instead. Next up, we have Tacet Marks. Most Resonators channel their abilities through their mark. It lights up when they exert their forte and sputters when they push themselves too far. One question I've seen people ask is whether the mark needs to be exposed for a Resonator to wield their powers, but this seems unlikely to me. As I mentioned a second ago, the Midnight Rangers is largely made up of Resonators. The story has shown that they're able to fight just fine while wearing uniforms that cover most of their bodies. This isn't too surprising given that Jinshi is able to resonate with Jue and sense its emotions across huge distances, so it makes sense that a layer of clothes wouldn't get in the way. In fact, although Resonators regularly make use of their Tacet Marks, it's possible they may not even need them. Zhang Liao awakened while he was exploring a dangerous Quarter Savante ruin. He lost his arm to one of the traps there, but he was able to use his forte, Matter Weaver, to create a prosthetic one, and as you can see, that's where his Tacet Mark is. This means there is a possibility that there was at least a brief period where he was wielding his abilities with no Tacet Mark. There's also the Shorekeeper, who is considered a Resonator but doesn't have a Tacet Mark. She instead has something called a Blazar Module Anchor, which is what attracts and condenses the remnant energy that makes up her body. Unlike other people who need to convert remnant energy into something else, she's able to resonate with it and wield it directly, so it's not a necessary feature of being a Resonator. Then, what's the point of a Tacet Mark? Well, although Tacet Marks are still a mystery, a common thread throughout the game has been that they often serve as a gateway into other places. In the case of a Resonator's Tacet Mark, their main role could be to serve as a storage space. As Resonators accumulate the resonance energy they use to wield their powers, it's reflected in the behavior of their mark, which grows larger or smaller depending on their reserves. This is supported by chronosorters created by the Quarter Savante. These are artificial resonance objects that mimic the way a Resonator might resonate with Jue to borrow a fraction of its time powers. However, if you take a careful look, you'll notice that there's nothing resembling a Tacet Mark anywhere on their frame. They don't need this to resonate. Chang Li explicitly states that you have to strike them to make them work, which suggests that they can use an injection of kinetic energy to fuel their resonance abilities in place of a local reserve. There's also the case of Abby. When Rover encounters Jue doesn't seem particularly surprised that Abby is able to reside inside Rover's Tacet Mark. In fact, Jue implies that this is only possible with Rover's approval, suggesting that this storage ability is a known feature of Tacet Marks, at least to Jue and pre-Amnesia Rover. However, Rover is an unusual existence, and it's also possible that it's just an extension of Rover's unique ability to absorb things into their flesh, so I take this with a pinch of salt. All of this really highlights just how strange Tacet Marks are and how little we know about them. For example, if we go back to the issue of Zhang Liao's arm, there's another mystery that's quite intriguing. We never see his bare arm before he loses it, but it's possible that he originally had a Tacet Mark in the same location as he does now. If that's the case, it suggests Tacet Marks might be more of a metaphysical trait than a physical one, but who knows? Moving on, Resonators also gain physical advantages, and I'm not talking about mutations, which I'll get to later. We regularly see them performing feats that no ordinary human could hope to imitate, and the comments of characters in the world make it clear that this physical disparity is common knowledge. There's even a part of Act 3 where Genshin duels someone to demonstrate the stark difference between a Resonator and an ordinary person, hoping to put him off trying to join the Midnight Rangers, where he's likely to lose his life. Even when she's not using her forte, he isn't able to stand up to a single blow. There's some variance between Resonators, for example Tao Chi is stated to have tougher skin than everybody else, so I can imagine that there are some Resonators who are innately stronger or weaker than the others, but at the very least, this advantage over ordinary people appears to be the norm. This isn't where the gap ends though. Resonators are also shown to be hardier, with greater resistance to things like toxic spores. They even have longer lifespans than ordinary people. Chichian mentions that Resonators tend to live to about 100 years. Jinshi also states something interesting, which is that it's unprecedented for them to live for centuries without any sign of aging, which tells us that it is theoretically possible for there to be Resonators who've lived for centuries, albeit with signs of aging. Sadly, we don't get much more information than that, so it's difficult to gauge whether this can happen naturally, or the longer lifespans are only ever granted by certain unique fortes. I am of course deliberately ignoring Rover, who has shown up repeatedly throughout Solaris 3's history and gives the impression of being ageless, because they're such an anomaly. Last but not least, Resonators can pick up on sounds outside of the range of human hearing, vibrations so minute that ordinary people would need equipment to detect them. This is different from resonance abilities used for scouting. I would imagine this is how most Resonators perceive the frequencies around them in order to single out the ones they're interested in and manipulate them with their resonance abilities. So, all in all, being a Resonator is a pretty sweet deal, especially in a post-apocalyptic world where you need all of the advantages you can get. Right? Not all of the time. First of all, during the process of awakening, there is a chance that you might develop irreversible mutations. Some Resonators are lucky and either don't get any, or get away with minor cosmetic changes like Chichia's hair turning red. Others, not so much. Mortefi is speculated to have resonated with an extinct draconic species known as the Dragonkin, and has therefore mutated dragon-like scales. As for Verena, it's easy to mistake the flowers on her ears for earrings, but they're not. These are actually sprouting from her flesh. Verena resonated with plants and literally has symbiotic flora growing out of her body. The long vine trailing behind her actually comes straight out of her upper spine. While these traits would be body horror for anyone else, they don't seem to bother her due to her love for plants, but I doubt the rest of us would share her enthusiasm. Secondly, fortes aren't always easy to control. Their stability is affected by a bunch of factors including their owner's emotional state, and many resonators are just one terrible day away from overclocking. Overclocking is essentially where your mind can't restrain your powers. It can be a result of overexertion, wearing your mind out by pushing yourself too far for too long. Or it can happen simply because something has caused your abilities to behave so erratically that you can't rein them in. Whatever the cause, the end result is that you produce an excess amount of something called resonance energy. This is yet another unexplored area as of now, but we can safely say that it's what your resonance abilities use to effect change. When uncontrolled, your resonance energy can wreak havoc in a number of ways, from altering your body and personality to unleashing destructive blizzards. The effects are different for everyone since they stem directly from your forte. Baija actually outlines that there are 3 levels of overclocking. She doesn't go into more detail, but she does mention that in extreme cases, the excess energy can even manifest as destructive tacet fields. As a quick side note, it's not hard to see how overclocking got its name. In tech terms, overclocking means raising a component's clock rate so it runs at a higher speed than its manufacturers intended, which boosts its performance but generally eats into the component's lifespan. In this case, your forte has reached the point where it's outstripped your ability to restrain it, and is unleashing power that your mind and body aren't equipped to handle. Overclocking isn't always an immediate death sentence, but even in cases where it isn't, each occurrence takes a cumulative toll. We've got a few examples. Yang Yang's forte allows her to attune to the surrounding air currents, which she refers to as the streams. Through these streams, she can sense everything in her environment, from physical objects to lingering emotions. The problem is that the streams bombard her with so much information that if she isn't careful, she runs the risk of her mind being overwhelmed. And that's exactly what happened. There was a time when she lost control of her forte and fell unconscious while it was still operating. Her powers continued to spiral out of control, causing the excess resonance energy to encroach on and transform her body. She now has feathers growing from her hair, and these are a permanent part of her body that will never go away. A scarier example is what could have happened to Jinshi during the events of Act 7. She kept pushing herself to the point where she began to overclock. Since her forte allows her to borrow Sentinel Jue's ability to control time, things could have gotten disastrous. As Jue put it, overclocking would have left her trapped within the fishes of time, being torn apart and repaired with no hope of escape for all of eternity. In other words, if she messed up, she'd have been doomed to a fate worse than death. These risks are the reason why scientists put so much emphasis on a Resonator's Forte Evaluation Report, within which there's a section dedicated to overclock diagnostics. It's to ensure that Resonators get the oversight and psychological counseling they need to avoid harming themselves and the people around them. Some Resonators are far more susceptible to overclocking than others. For example, since your psychological state directly influences your control over your forte, people who are experiencing intense emotions or who have underlying mental health issues can run into problems. A person's forte can also be destabilized by external factors like the puppets created by the Seance Society in Gilin's companion quest, which influence a person's mind in order to replicate their loved ones. On the flip side, the opposite is also possible. Verena's symbiotic plants can emit a special frequency band that calms her mind. Lastly, the way a Resonator awakens also has a pretty big impact on their ability to control their forte. It's so important that scientists have come up with Rabelle's curves to categorize people into one of a few groups: natural, mutant, and congenital, as well as a potential future fourth group, artificial resonators. Rabelle's curves are used to track the behavior of a resonator's resonance frequency over time. They provide a broad view of how a resonator's energy output fluctuates as they use their forte, and are usually paired with waveform graphs that follow these oscillations in much more detail. We haven't seen either of these types of curves yet, so I can't say for sure what they look like, but I can at least depict how I view them in my head. Firstly, let me introduce the waveform graphs. The amplitude of the line here represents the intensity of your forte at any given moment. Amplitude directly correlates to the energy contained in a wave, so we can safely say that the bigger these are, the greater the amount of resonance energy being unleashed by your forte. However, the amount of power you can control isn't infinite. These red lines represent your criticality level, the amount of resonance energy your mind can safely restrain. Ideally, you want to make sure that the fluctuations of your forte stay within this boundary, but if you struggle with stability, things might not go your way. You try to create a spark and suddenly you're overclocking and shooting lightning out of your ass. This is why these traits are so important. If you've got a higher criticality, you've got more breathing room, and if your forte is more stable, you're better able to ramp your forte up and down without it suddenly spiking to a level you can't handle. By contrast, a Rabelle's curve focuses less on the moment-to-moment specifics of your resonance fluctuations, and more on the general intensity of your resonance energy output during a session of testing your forte. So let's take a look at how these correlate to each type of resonator. Natural resonators are people who at first glance seem to have awakened spontaneously, but my suspicion is that they've actually awakened gradually after being exposed to something over a long period of time. Let's use Yang Yang again. As mentioned earlier, she reported heightened sensitivity to her environment from an early age. She would obviously have been in regular contact with air and, presumably, in close proximity to birds. Yuanwu's situation is similar, although he was instead exposed to powerful electrical energy for extended times. My guess would be that becoming a natural resonator is less about the intensity of whatever you're exposed to than the period over which you're exposed to it. Their Rabelle's curves are characterized by a gradual rise, indicating a stable and controlled increase in resonance energy as they lean into their abilities. Mutant Resonators are kind of the opposite of natural resonators. Their awakening is usually catalyzed by a big event like a psychological shock or emotional outburst. I previously mentioned Dungeon, who was enraged by the murder of her family, so much so that even now she roams Huanglong hunting down criminals. Then there's Calcharo, who awakened during his struggle-filled childhood in the Dead Zone, and Mortifi, who is basically a scientist-shaped ball of pent-up frustration, whose awakening was accompanied by a surge of intense anger. Their Rabelle's curves display a steep rise in the middle. Their powers tend to ramp up quickly and suddenly, and so they often struggle to maintain control of what their forte is doing. It shouldn't come as a surprise then that Dungeon, Calcharo, and Mortifi all have a documented history of overclocking or getting pretty close to it. Even someone disciplined like Sanhua is no different. She tends to cause temperature drops when she's shy, and despite her forte's high stability, she's constantly on the verge of hitting her criticality. However, there are notable exceptions like Jiyan and Zhang Liao, whose powers are quite stable in addition to having a high criticality, so being a mutant resonator doesn't guarantee that your powers are going to be a volatile time bomb. Congenital resonators are quite hard to suss out, but the name is a pretty big clue. By definition, something congenital is a trait that's present at birth. It's safe to assume that congenital resonators are either born awakened or are genetically predisposed toward awakening very early. Yinlin is an especially interesting congenital resonator because her forte is arguably the reason she's even alive. She was born with an abnormal heart rhythm that may or may not have been caused by her forte, but what's for certain is that without her forte's electrical influence to regulate her heartbeat, she could very well die. She's even used her forte to jumpstart her heart after someone with the ability to interfere with heartbeats caused it to stop during a fight. What's kind of fascinating about congenital resonators is that their Rabelle's curves have a sinusoidal curve. This implies a sort of rhythm when they resonate. It's almost as though they have some sort of innate reflex that helps their output cycle up and down predictably rather than spiking uncontrollably. However, that doesn't mean all of them have high stability. Zheji and Encore both suffer from instability, but this could be due to psychological reasons, as both of them were brought up under challenging circumstances. Encore does show moments of maturity, but at the end of the day, she's a child who's had to deal with the trauma of her mother's death and what's implied to be some sort of awful experience at the orphanage she ended up in before the Blackshaws found her. She craves companionship and regularly escapes into her own whimsical world. Zheji also had a turbulent upbringing where she was exploited by her parents until she stood up for herself and they abandoned her, and as an adult, she now seems to struggle with uncertainty and self-doubt. So their forte's instability could very well be a result of their unresolved emotional struggles, impacting how they wield their resonance powers. Artificial resonators are the odd one out because they've only been referenced once in the entire game by Frolova, a Fraxidus Overseer. As a result, we don't have any information about them as of now. While we do run into a lot of Fraxidus members, that's not too helpful because their descriptions make it clear that most of them aren't actually resonators. It's explicitly stated that many of these Fractidus artificers don't have fortes. They instead get their powers from the Tacet Discord pods they've grafted to their bodies. For example, this is how Fractidus thrusters get their immense strength. True artificial resonators are probably going to be more like Scar and Falova, who both have Tacet Marks. This is supported by what Falova says after we wreck the Fractidus scheme in Hongzhen, and she reveals that it was all according to Keikaku.
With the second resonance awakening, we will tap into powers that rival the Sentinels. Complete control of the artificial resonator awakening process is within reach.
Since the Fractidus are pursuing a second awakening, and don't worry, I'll get to that soon, it's clear that they've cracked how to produce resonators with the first. They just don't have full control over the method. That said, we have no way to tell whether Scar and Falova themselves are artificial resonators. So that sums up the different types of resonators and their relationship with their powers and overclocking. Before I move on though, I should address a question I've seen people ask, which is whether a non-resonator can overclock. My personal belief is yes, but not normally. Since ordinary people don't have a forte in the first place, there shouldn't be any way for overclocking to happen. However, it's made clear that even ordinary Fractidus members can overclock. This is almost certainly because of their TD grafts. These parts are dangerous and distort the minds and bodies of the people who've attached them, so it's not surprising that many Fractidus members lose control of the powers they're borrowing. We also see something similar in a note you can find about the Swan Ni, that is, Lingyang species. It says, in later research it was confirmed that Swan Ni possess a special power similar to the resonance ability. Even a powerful Swan Ni can overclock like resonators. So no under normal circumstances because non-resonators don't have any powers to lose control of, but also yes because belonging to certain species or relying on external methods like the grafts the Fractidus use make it possible. Now on to second awakenings. It's possible for a resonator who has already awakened to awaken again. The collision between two frequencies that are resonating with each other can trigger this metamorphosis, amplifying the power of a resonator's pre-existing abilities, assuming they survive. In Act 7, Jinshi wants to fix the temporal distortion threatening Hongzhen and the rest of Jinzhou. She needs to undergo a second resonance awakening to become strong enough to inherit Jue's temporal mandate, the power that grants Jue control over time. However, this process is extremely dangerous. When two resonating powers clash, it can have severe repercussions, especially for the weaker party. The court of Savante tested this process with their chronosorters, but the devices were all shredded from the backlash and turned to dust. Fortunately, the information they got, with a little help, allowed them to theorize that the key to a successful second awakening was a state similar to a human overclocking. Jinshi was eventually able to survive the backlash of a battle with Jue and enter this special state without succumbing to the dangers of overclocking. She successfully reached her second awakening. In my mind, this brings up some interesting possibilities about how the process of awakening actually works. My theory is that a resonator's first and second awakening both involve a surge of resonance energy remolding their frequencies. A second awakening requires drastically more resonance energy to push that transformation further, which is why it's so precarious. The resonator has to not only tank the backlash of clashing with whatever they're resonating with, but they also need to restrain the sheer amount of resonance energy suffusing them without losing control and being pushed over the brink into overclocking. With that said, I'm also interested in whether a resonator can gain brand new powers by resonating with a different set of frequencies from the original source of their awakening. I don't see why this wouldn't be possible in theory, since this might be what Rover is doing when they switch affinities. Then again, Rover is Rover. Also, talking about second awakenings naturally brings up the question of whether we'll see a third or a fourth awakening, and maybe we will. But given how dangerous a second awakening is already, it's probably unlikely that anyone would survive. There's one last resonator adjacent lore bombshell we just had dropped on us in the intro to the Infinite Battle event, which is that Threnodians also have fortes. Threnodians are extremely powerful TDs that are born from the dark side of mankind's collective consciousness and feed on their collapsed will. Could it be that they've consumed so many frequencies that they've become human enough to awaken? Or will it turn out that they were originally resonators and they fell victim to the lament and became Threnodians through some horrible twist of fate? We don't have much to go on at the moment, so it's anyone's guess. One question worth asking though is whether they count as resonators. I would argue yes. The Shorekeeper is an energy construct and yet she's considered a resonator, not some sort of resonance object. So my guess is that having a persona is what allows you to awaken your own individualized forte. Most TDs aren't intelligent, they're just a bundle of frequencies trying to devour things on pure instinct and mimicking the victims they've eaten. Although they can be directed, they're implied to be more like deadly roaming amoebas with the ability to mimic new approaches than beings making rational decisions. But there are exceptions. We've seen glimpses of a personality in a powerful Calamity class TD like the Dreamless, which seems to speak in broken sentences and have fragments of a personality. This could also be empty mimicry, but it's also possible that there's something going on inside the Dreamless's head, and I think it's likely that an even more powerful being, a Threnodian, has an actual conscious mind. When you couple this with the fact that TDs have cores, which may serve the same role as a Shorekeeper's Blazar module anchor or a Resonator's Tacet Mark, it seems even more likely to me. But who knows? There are simply too many unknowns as of now, so I can't really say anything with certainty. My conclusions about what makes a Resonator may need revision. It's definitely something worth keeping an eye on. So, I think that's about it. That should be most of what we currently know about Resonators. Taking all of the stuff in this video into consideration, it's hard to miss how most Resonators seem to be a bit too convenient to be a natural occurrence, especially their Tacet Marks. To me, it raises the question of whether Resonators have been genetically engineered into the population. In fact, the phrase awakening a forte implies that this potential was already lying dormant. We've seen the goddess imbuing Rover with a Tacet Mark, which shows that at least one person has the means to manufacture them with ease. Coupled with what we know about pre-Amnesia Rover's goals to avert a terrible outcome, and the way the Sentinels have been tasked with watching over mankind, it's clear that there's a guiding hand behind the growth of civilization that may be responsible. Is it Rover? The goddess? The ancient civilization? Maybe all of the above? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for watching, and see you later.